Hi, Dr. Terry. Thanks so much for joining me today on concentrating on
Hey, David,
chromatography.
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics in terms of PFAS, and I'd love for you to be able to tell our listeners who may not be familiar with this work, what are you focused on at the University of Alabama, and what types of problems is your lab solving?
So, we are part of the Central Analytical Water Quality Lab at UA. So, it's the Center for Water Quality Research. And we have an analytical lab where we can take water samples and we can test the contaminants in that sample to very low levels. What are those contaminants? So, potable water is essentially what our lab focuses on.
And was there something that originally drew you to working on PFAS?
So we look at organic contaminants and emerging contaminants. And so with PFAS, it just blew up. It got in the news, it got in regulations. Folks were sending out requests for proposals to work in this area. And I resisted it for a while. But then it finally was like, oh, I got to do it. And then I went all in. And so PFAS, they've been around since the 1940s. So they're not new, but they're new in the sense that people are becoming more aware that they're in our bodies and they're toxic. Some are known toxic, some are potentially toxic, things that we don't want to be breathing or drinking or eating. And so the awareness has increased in the public sector. So now they're more known, but they've been around since the 1940s. They're not new.
And my understanding, and I'm certainly learning more and more, but in terms of the EPA methodologies I've learned about, a lot of those started being created around maybe 2018 or 2019 when some of those were actually published.
Yes.
But yeah, just as a frame of reference for in terms of these standardized tests actually entering existence, let's say, and then certainly commercial or environmental labs using those tests, but also academic researchers being able to refer to what the EPA is saying in terms of actual protocols. It's
Right,
pretty
yes, and we
new.
have to have a standardized way to test for contaminants so we compare from lab to lab. And so the standardized methods are newer.
And people who may be somewhat familiar with this topic may have heard about chemicals such as PFOA or PFOS. How much larger is the general PFAS universe relative to these well-known
So that
examples?
defense PFOA and PFOS are the two considered legacy PFAS contaminants because they're the ones that were the originals. And then since then, there's been a lot of spinoffs where you can change one little bit of the molecular structure and you have an entirely different PFAS. So there can be over thousands of them, but in regulations, we're currently focused on two here for federal. Some states have done more of a total PFAS additive regulation, but for federal, PFOA and PFOS are the main ones that we're focusing on. And then each state can go stricter if they want. But we don't know, and it depends on how you quantify it, how you define PFAS. So you're going to say that's a typical researcher answer, but don't know yet. It's because there's so many new molecules, and where if you just change the carbon, we talk about the carbon chain, how many carbons are in the chain and attached to the fluorines. If you cleave that off, it's a new molecule. If you have a different head group, it's a new molecule or compound. And so it depends on how you define PFAS. And that is in debate in the scientific community. But some say over 10,000, some say a higher number, but it's more of what are these compounds? What are they doing in the industry and why are they there? Do we need them there? Are they essential? Are they non essential? And can we stop producing the non essential ones?
Yeah, as an aside, it seems as you read more about this topic that everything is so much in the early stages. And by that, I mean even the potential harm that it causes to humans. We're very much still learning about these compounds in general, but then also what the long-term health ramifications are. We're just still starting to learn about what the issues
Yes,
are
that's
here.
right. And that's where it gets a little tricky because to go for a contaminant to be put in the regulations, the EPA has three qualifications: to be present in the water sources, to be toxic to humans, and then the third one is to provide a meaningful opportunity for this contaminant to be removed. And so essentially, if it's going to be expensive to do this and the utilities are going to go bankrupt, we don't want to do it. So a sense of that a meaningful opportunity can be interpreted based on the contaminant. And so with PFAS, the second one, the toxicity, sometimes we don't know. And so there needs to be more research on the toxicity of the individual PFAS compounds as well as the mixture as a whole. So they often co-occur. If you find one, you're likely to find another. And so what does that toxicity of a mixture? And that's why it's hard to define the regulations because of that toxicity piece.
And people may be familiar with the general term
Mm-hmm.
forever chemicals because that's somewhat been the general label, I suppose, that's been used. But what makes these compounds so chemically persistent and mobile in water
Well, we
systems?
need to change the marketing on forever chemicals because we don't want them to be forever. So we think of a different term, but you're correct. Everyone refers to them as forever chemicals because they have two reasons why they're hard to degrade and they bioaccumulate. One is that they have a water loving head and a water resistant tail, so that they can be in water or in aqueous phase or in solid or gas phase. And so that nature, normally a molecule is either going to be hydrophobic or hydrophilic. PFAS or both, depending on the head or the tail. So that's the first thing. And the second is the strength of the carbon to fluorine bond. So that is one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry that's synthetic and that we've made. And so that bond takes the energy of pretty much lightning to break it. So those two things combined make PFAS really hard to destroy.
And I certainly agree with you on the rebranding. One of the best explanations I've heard from another researcher was kind of the going back in history in that some of these compounds were produced on
Mhm.
purpose to be hard
Yes.
to destruct.
Yes.
So that's kind of what we're dealing with now. You made something that was indestructible, but to the degree it causes health issues, how do we go about solving
Mm-hmm.
that problem? So, in terms of a wastewater treatment plant, what actually happens to PFAS when they enter the system? Do they degrade or just pass through, or does something else
So they
happen?
tend to stick to either the aqueous solid interface or the aqueous gas interface. So they don't want to be completely in the aqueous phase. They want to be on the transfer phase. So if you have foaming in wastewater treatment plants, then they'll be in that aqueous to foam phase. Or if you have in the biological basin the solids, you'll find them adhere to the solids and then settle out and get in the biosolids. Some will go in the effluent, the aqueous effluent, but ideally you'll find them in those in phase transfers.
And my understanding is that most of their regulatory monitoring relies on targeted LCMS. What are some of the strengths or limitations even of using that approach?
So you're correct. Most of or the regulations are looking at specific PFAS, and so PFOA, PFOS, specific ones at a certain MCL, which is a maximum contaminant level. Right now, it's 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. So if you're above that in a drinking water treatment plant, those are the current regulations. So if you're above that, you would be in violation. Utilities do have a little bit of time to get in compliance, but that approach, the strength is that the utilities know exactly what they need to be testing for. They know the limit, and then they know the toxicity of those two PFAS. But there's a limitation in the sense that there's so many more PFAS compounds, and we're not getting the whole story. So it's an underestimation of PFAS in the water if you're just looking at those two.
In reading up on your lab and listening to your appearance on the Noon Show, I'm going to need an explanation as far as what the fluorine mass balance problem is. Could you explain that and why
Yeah,
it
so
matters?
that whenever you have a PFAS compound, a PFAS molecule, the fluorine has replaced hydrogen. So carbon likes hydrogen, and it's because it helps complete the electron shell. So scientists back in the 40s, they replaced that hydrogen with fluorine. So if you saying you're destroying PFAS, but you just cleave off one of those carbons, then you're going to release that fluoride ion, and then you can do a mass balance of the PFAS coming in, the fluoride ion, you can use an ion chromatography, and then do a mass balance of where is it going, and am I just breaking down that one PFOA to make a shorter PFAS compound, or am I actually destroying it, meaning cleaving all those carbons off in the chain. And so if you'll have technologies that say we can remove 99.99% of PFAS, and there will be an asterisk, and that asterisk is saying we're just converting PFOA to a shorter chain PFAS that we currently can't detect, or it'll say something like of that we can detect. And so it's a little misleading. And so if you do the mass balance, you can actually tell if you actually destroyed the PFAS.
You commented on using targeted analysis, generally speaking. How much of the PFAS burden, let's say, is missed by only doing targeted analysis?
So when you mention targeted, the alternative is the bulk analysis, looking at can we quantify all the PFAS that are in a water sample. But we can do that looking at adsorbable organic fluorine or extractable organic fluorine. And the difference of those two are just how you prep the sample. And so we're going to try to capture all of that organic fluorine onto granular activated carbon, and you take that and you put it into a combustion IC and you combust it, and you can measure all that, the fluoride that would be on there as organic fluorine, which means it's attached to a carbon. So that's going to tell you an idea of the total organic fluorine in the sample, but that can also come from pharmaceuticals that have attached to a carbon. It could come from personal care products, so more things than just PFAS. So it gives you an idea of all the organic fluorine. So that's a limitation that we can't tell, but you can combine it with the targeted method, because if you're taking a targeted and a bulk together, they can be complementary and give you an idea of what's happening. Are you actually destroying the PFAS, or are you just making a shorter chain? And you can quantify what's coming in, what's leaving, and then as well as the fluoride ions that you create.
Out of curiosity, is this combustion ion chromatography something you had experience with previously, or was it a situation where you had a specific problem to solve and this happened to be the best type of chromatography for you to apply to complement
Yeah,
LCMS?
so wrote a proposal to NSF and to go to the water tower, which is in Beaufort, Georgia, and because they have this instrument. And so we said we'd go, we'd learn from them, and we'd bring that expertise back to UA. And I had a phenomenal PhD student that's still here, and she did that. And we learned on their instrument, and then we were able to get the same instrument here on campus. And so that was one of the ones where we said, let's just try this out. Let's go for it, write a research proposal and see if it works. The detection limits are not low enough for drinking water, we've realized. We're just not there yet, but it works well for wastewater where you have higher concentrations.
So between combining the bulk and targeted analysis, what kinds of surprises end up presenting themselves in the data by using this combined
We found
approach?
that in wastewater treatment, we're only able to capture about 4% of the AOF, that adsorbable organic fluorine, with our targeted PFOS analysis. So if we look at 40 different PFOS compounds, that comprises 4% of the overall AOF. So we're missing a lot of organic fluorine.
And one concern that labs have when they start doing any sort of PFAS analysis is that their general laboratory might have a lot of sources of
Mm-hmm.
contamination throughout the lab. How do you guard against some of those unexpected sources of contamination? And that obviously you can't have something coming off of a glove, for example, that's going to taint your sample and the
Yeah,
results.
that's a great question. So you have to be very strict in your quality control. So anytime we get a new box of cartridges or new box of the carbon tubes, we always test it first with just DI water and run it through our instrument to see if there's any PFAS coming off, because there can be contamination in your consumables even when the label says PFAS free. So we call it a batch. We'll order a batch of let's say wax, a weak ion exchange, the wax cartridges, and we'll test a couple of those first, just DI water, to make sure there's not any leaching of PFAS. And then we'll do that. We'll say, okay, this batch is cleared. And then we'll do it for every other batch that we order of all of our consumables, because it is the case where they can be in consumables and can contaminate your sample. And then you're trying to figure out where it came from. So if you just do that in the beginning, it helps eliminate headaches later. And so that's a way to do it. Another thing is, if you go to the field and you're collecting field samples, always take some deionized water and you pour it into a sample bottle in the field as you would if you're collecting the sample, and you can test that, and that's your field blank. And then you can have blanks throughout your analysis as well to see if there's any contamination that's popping up that would inflate your values.
I appreciate you mentioning that because it's the first time I've heard someone get into the actual proactive steps they're taking in their lab to ensure that they don't have that contamination. And I assume it happens in other labs as well, but it's actually very cool to hear about the steps you're actually taking to prevent all sorts of issues. I'm sure sample loss would be one of those main issues where, oh no, we have to do this
Right. And
over.
then sometimes it's not feasible to go back to the field site if it's 4 hours away or wherever it is. And so if you can just catch that on the front end, and then we have clearly mark it, this has been tested and it's clears. And then the next order that comes in, you got to do it. So it does increase the amount of consumables because you're burning some on just DI water, but it's worth it.
And from the perspective of a water utility, what are the treatment technologies that are best suited for removing PFAS from drinking water? For example, I don't know if something like a reverse osmosis approach would work, or what do you think works best
So it'll
currently?
depend on the concentration of PFAS that are coming in the influent, but there's three that are the gold standards in the US right now, or that are being used. One is GAC filter, granular activated carbon. The second is ion exchange. And then the third is that membrane reverse osmosis. And so, depending on the influent water quality, where you are located in the US, you could have different advantages for picking one of those, but those are the three that are typically used. There's a lot of treatment that's being piloted that's new, but those are the three that are known and tried and true.
And I know that specifically your research has looked at membrane filtration and nanofiltration systems. What have you learned about their effectiveness, and is there anything you'd like to highlight about that work?
So my lab myself, we don't do membrane filtration, but my office neighbors do. So Dr. Wyman, who you've had on the podcast before, he does membrane filtration. And so I look at the pretreatment step, looking at biological filtration, which does not remove PFAS, but it can remove the organic matter that would foul the membrane. So it's in series. So first put the water through the biological filter in order for the microbes to remove the organic matter, which the organic matter fouls the membrane. So if you remove it first, then the membrane can focus on removing the PFAS. And so we've had, and with Dr. Esfahanis, who's also in chemical engineering at UA, we've had success in that. And so while my lab doesn't do membranes, we have the expertise here. And so if a student wants to do it, we have that expertise.
Yeah, and as an aside, that was definitely part of the reason I was so excited to learn more about your operation as a whole, and that I'm sure other departments like this exist, but the idea of a water quality lab, it does seem like it's pretty unique because frankly, I haven't come across another one, and I speak with academic researchers pretty frequently at conferences. So what you're doing is certainly unique.
It's yeah, thanks. It's great. It's fun. It's connect the different researchers on campus that are doing water quality, water treatment type of work, and seeing how the technologies that everyone's working on in their individual wet labs can be combined to produce potable water.
Now, I'm not sure if this question makes sense, and as I read it over again, maybe I didn't do the best job working through this, but are there cases where there's a treatment technology, but the PFAS can somewhat pass through in terms of it's just moved through the process and still escapes, and then I suppose this, you're still facing that contamination issue if it passes by the filter.
Yes, so conventional treatment in the US, if you're treating a surface water, so not groundwater, but a surface water, you have to have a conventional treatment train. And that's coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation, filtration, and disinfection. And none of those are particularly good at removing PFAS. So that's why utilities have to monitor to see, A, do they have PFAS in their influent water? And if they do, they often have to add additional treatment. And so if they had that filtration step, if they had sand anthracite filter, they would need to replace that sand anthracite with GAC. But with that, GAC is an absorption, so PFAS absorb to the GAC, and those sites become exhausted, where you're not absorbing anymore. And natural organic matter can also compete on those absorption sites, and so you would have to replace that GAC ever so often based on that concentration coming in and what level you need to get it to.
And I noticed that your team has been involved in large regional monitoring projects. What have those studies revealed about how widespread this PFAS contamination issue
So
is?
we Yes, we have an EPA project looking at monitoring PFAS in the Gulf Coast. We're focused on within 100 miles of the coast in Mississippi and Alabama. Also, just water, not sediments. It's an aqueous phase. And so we have found that whenever you find one PFAS, you're going to find another. So they co occur, but they're either there or they're not. So it's either, and there's a point source nearby that you can attribute the contamination to. So not always. Sometimes it's like, wow, where did that come from? If it's on a groundwater, because groundwater aquifers, how they move, sometimes it's not what we would think. But for surface water, typically you're going to be able to find something nearby, an industrial activity, manufacturing, military plant, carpet business. So and we've typically been able to figure out where the source is coming from. Something that's interesting is that out west, there was a study that was done in the Las Vegas watershed, and they found that wastewater treatment plant effluents were a large contributor of PFAS into the surface water. But the flow was about 85%, I think, of the stream of wastewater effluent. But we found here in Alabama, the wastewater treatment plant effluents leaving the wastewater treatment plant going into a receiving water body, it actually doesn't contribute that much to the PFAS load in the river or the stream because that flow rate is only 3% of the overall flow rate of the river. So I think for that wastewater treatment plant effluent, it depends on the precipitation of that state and how much water the stream volumes and the river volumes and where you're discharging into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and obviously very critical projects to understand how these communities are impacted by this contamination. Looking forward, what analytical tools or approaches do you think will transform how we're monitoring PFAS relative to how we're doing it
It's a
today?
great question. So today it takes such analytical expertise and money and to have the instruments on hand. And so it's an arduous process that is frankly hard to do and it's hard not to get it contaminated. And so we've definitely had a lot of trial and error in this. But I think in the future, if there a way to get to an in situ monitoring where you can have a probe or something and test for PFAS and or some way to make it less analytically intensive to where you have to be so precise and so but the levels are so low ppt level so and there's other things in the water but if there was something where you can do it on site that would be great an in situ type probe is there a way to make it less expensive and the consumables are so expensive so and then the instruments are expensive so it's just an expensive process so a way to bring down the cost a little bit.
And certainly that might be the best answer to the next question. But I was curious, what major PFAS problem do you hope we're able to solve over the coming years? And I suppose one that I'm not super familiar with because my exposure is more on the analysis and testing side, but it seems like the destruction side of PFAS is a
Mm-hmm.
whole nother challenge that are facing people like the water treatment facilities, and that's a whole difficult challenge in itself.
So if I could, you're asking if I could be queen and say something what to fix this, what would it be? I think I would actually take a step back and say to the industry, if first before we find a chemical works and it's good at what it does and it makes our process more efficient and we can, capitalize on it before we put it into the market that's going to be exposed to humans, let's first test to see the toxicity towards humans instead of taking a approach of cleaning it up later, like, oh, whoops, that's actually not good for humans, we got to clean all that up, and we're still producing it. So I would go back to the beginning and can we somehow make a law that before a chemical goes onto the market we have to show that it's not toxic to humans or aquatic life. And I understand essential uses. I'm all for technology and I think humans are so cool that we've been able to invent these things and make cars and transportation and all of that. But for the chemicals that we're going to be putting in food and our and different household products, let's just make sure, let's do a preliminary test and see if they're toxic before we just blast them. But that would be if I was queen. So if that doesn't happen, I would think in order to remove PFAS, if we can help our utilities, the burden's on them to remove PFAS and it's expensive. So they're going to have to either raise rates, which that's hard because, the city council or mayors may be running on platforms that say we're not going to raise rates. And so they don't want to do that. And it's a complex issue. And then the water treatment facilities don't manufacture it and they don't use it, but they have the burden of cleaning it up. And so if there's a way to kind of lift them up and support them and help them and say, we know you didn't cause this problem, but we need to help you remove it. That would be great, is to give them more credit and to help them better do a job that they are not responsible for, or in the sense of it cause it.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about as far as private companies certainly say we can't afford to raise prices in terms of they don't think their buyers will be able to afford a price increase. But for these utilities, they literally cannot raise prices because it's out of their hands in terms of how those price levels are
Right. Yes.
controlled. Now, I have limited exposure in this space as far as organimation equipment being cited in some of the EPA methods, but do people tell you a lot when they throw away their nonstick cookware? Because people know I'm kind of involved in this space, and people are always saying, "Oh, I've been learning more about this, and I've decided to throw all
They
these
do.
things out."
They do. But it's interesting. The a recent graph I saw was that exposure from drinking water is actually 20% of our overall exposure to PFAS. So drinking water is my world, but there's 80% of exposure coming from some other places. So whether that's breathing it in, whether that's eating off of fast food wrappers. So it's interesting that while I'm focused in water, that's actually only 20% of our exposure.
Yeah, no, I,
But you're right. People tell me all the time.
yeah, that's. Lee, is there anything else you would like people to know about your lab and the work that's being done at the Water Research Center?
I would say know where your water is coming from, trust your tap, but know where it's coming from, but then have trust in the system. And then another question I get is, do I have an in-home filter? And so I do. I trust my utility, but I also have an in-home filter because that water travels underground in pipe into my house. That part I can't control as much, and I have young children, so they're more susceptible to contamination. For they're young, they're growing, their brains are developing. And so if it was just me, I would not have an in-home filter, but since I do have young children, I have an in-home filter for that extra security. But I make sure we drink tap water. We're not bottled water family. And so I trust my utility to deliver clean water. I also know where the water comes from. I read the annual water quality report every year. So I do my own due diligence, and then I have an in-home filter just because of my young children. So I would say to the people to know where your water is coming from and how you can best also complement municipal water with treatment that you need for your specific family. And then in terms of the water quality lab, I think people come visit us. Like come visit us and see our water quality lab. We'd love to host you on campus. If you're a student, reach out. We're always recruiting great undergrad and graduate students. And then just follow our research.
Very cool. Yeah, I will definitely make sure to share those links. And yeah, certainly someday I hope to be able to visit you in person and learn about the latest and greatest that's going on
Yeah,
in
that would be
Alabama.
excellent. We'd love to have you.
Well, thanks, Lee. I really appreciate the time today, and thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with the audience on this absolutely critical topic. So I
Thanks, David.
appreciate
Thanks for
it.
having me.